I would like to study with you a tshuva. What is a tshuva? A tshuva is a halachic responsum that we study in the Beis Medrash all the time in yeshiva. Halachic responsa is a method of conveying a halachic decision among post-Talmudic rabbis. Post-Talmudic rabbis will not write a tractate of law, but what they will often do is they will be presented with questions and they will render an answer to the halachic query and put their answer into writing. And then that answer, that tshuva, that answer gets compiled in a series of, together with a series of tshuvot, of tshuvas, of responses, and that's compiled in a book. So almost every great rabbinic decisor from post-Talmudic era to the present has a sefer called the Shilos Tshuvas of so-and-so. Shilos Tshuvas of the Chassam Sofer, Shilos Tshuvas of the Rashba, Shilos Tshuvas of this rabbi, that rabbi, and so forth. Who was the Sridei Eish, which we're just going to jump to number 3. The Sridei Eish was the name of a sefer that was compiled by Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg, who was a rabbi who lived in post-war, originally in Eastern Europe, and then moved to Germany. He learned in the Yeshiva of Berlin, and was a brilliant halachic mind, and survived the war, thankfully, and lived out the rest of his life in Montreux. I think it was Montreux in Switzerland. And this is certainly where this responsum is written in the year Tafshin Tet, which is about 1949. Very good, thank you. Writes this in 1949 in Montreux. Rabbi Chil Yaakov Weinberg was a bit of a Renaissance man. He was a bit of everything. He was Haredi in one sense, and he was very modern in another sense in his outlook on religious ideologies. And that's one of the reasons why he never made Aliyah. So he revealed to one of his friends in a letter. He says he wrote that Eretz Yisrael, at least in the time that he was living, he said is so polarized between the Haredi world and the Mizrahi world. He says, I wouldn't know where to fit in. He says, I would fall in between the crack, between those two worlds. He says, I wouldn't know where to go. And that was one of the reasons why he didn't feel comfortable making Aliyah. Well, I'm not saying that that's a valid justification. That was his personal justification. He just felt that the climate was overly politicized in the religious community, and he didn't feel comfortable in either committing to either camp. But let's see what he writes as far as the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos. He says, Inyan Rishon mipnei ma ein mevarchim al Mishloach Manos. Why don't we make a bracha when we deliver Shalach Manos to our friend? He says, Bepurim zeh hirharti b'kushyata acharonim. He says, this Purim, I was thinking about the question that many of the latter rabbis ask. Lama ein mevarchim al Mishloach Manos. Why don't we make a bracha on Shalach Manos? Lefitam harashba she'ein mevorchim al hatzdaka shemalo yikabel. Now let's think about it for a second. Why don't we make a bracha on giving tzedakah? Guy comes to your door and you give him tzedakah. You're not supposed to make a bracha. Why not? It's a mitzvah. You're fulfilling a mitzvah of tzedakah. Why not make a bracha? Asher kedishana b'mitzvah savet zivanu laseis tzedakah. So the Rashba has an interesting answer, and he says the reason is because maybe he won't accept it. Have you ever heard of such a thing? But the Rashba says maybe he won't accept it. And therefore, how could you make the bracha?
Well, we heard the Mishloachim, if you give them it's not enough for them.
Okay. So if you were to make the bracha, and he would say, no, I don't want it, so then it would be a bracha levatala. It would be a wasteful bracha.
I don't think that's the reason.
1 second, okay, I mean, we just got started. So he says, that answer would not suffice for Mishloach Manos. You know why? He says, because v'harei gabe Mishloach Manot yotzi'in af imeino mekabel. He says, you fulfill the mitzvah of Shalach Manos even if the recipient refuses delivery. If you just leave it at their doorstep and they don't want it, you still fulfill the mitzvah according to many poskim, K'moshe Kosav, Harama, or Achaim, Simitafrei Tzadihei, Sif Daled, etc. He says that's the way the Shulchan Aruch rules. So therefore, you can't use that as a reason for not making a bracha because it's not dependent upon the other person's acceptance. Uve'emet nireh, but he says, but when you think about it further, it would seem she'en kavanas harashba di'ikalamecha shemelo yikabelote birchasu levatal. He says, that's not really what the Rashba means, that you have to worry that he's not going to accept the tzedakah, and therefore your bracha will be a wasteful bracha. Dema yomar lemisha nosein la'ani hamivakesh nedava, because what will the Rashba say if the poor person initiates and says, would you please give me a donation? There surely you know that he'll accept, well, maybe not. There you surely know that he'll accept your money if he asks you for money. So why wouldn't you be justified in making a bracha there? Ela kavanasa, but really what the Rashba really means is she'ein mevarchim al mitzvah she'eina tuluya be'oseh ha-mitzvah levado ela gam ba'acher. The real reason why you don't make a bracha is because shalach manos is you need a giver and you need a recipient in order to fulfill the mitzvah. By my giving shalach manos, I'm only doing half a mitzvah. By my giving tzedakah, I'm only doing half a mitzvah. You can't make a bracha on half a mitzvah because you can't give tzedakah unless there's someone else to receive it. You can't give shalach manos to a wall. You give shalach manos to a person. So therefore, since you need someone else outside of you in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you can't make a bracha. He says, "Ve'efshar shemitam zeh in mevorchem al nesinas truma lekohen, av shegam hanesina hi mitzvah kamo ha'hafrasha shalem mevorchem." That could also be the reason why, when you tithe and you give your tithes to a kohen, you don't make a bracha when you give him the tithe, even though you make a bracha when you actually tithe it from the rest of your produce. But when you give the kohen the produce that you have tithe, you don't make a bracha. There too, the reason is not because you're worried that he won't accept it, but rather the concern is any mitzvah that requires more than one person to fulfill does not warrant an individual making a bracha. You can only make a bracha on a mitzvah that you yourself can do all by yourself. Okay, so that's answer number one, why you wouldn't make a bracha on Mishloach Manot. Okay, let's go on. Va'od nirali. I'd like to suggest another answer. Shemishloach Manot hi laharbot shalom ve'ahava v're'ut. This is, what's the whole purpose of giving shalach manos on Purim? The whole purpose is that we know what was Haman's accusation against the Jewish people. He says this is an am mifuzar umeforad bein ha'amim. This is a scattered and discombobulated people. They are all over the place. They have no sense of cohesiveness, of unity. They're all over the place, and there's no community among the Jews. How do we rectify that problem? On Purim, we come together as a community. And that's the purpose of Shalach Manos, is to create greater friendship, is to create greater cohesiveness within our friends, within our community. And by the way, I'll just say parenthetically, that's one of the reasons why I'm opposed to there being so many different minyanim for the Megillah reading. It goes contrary to the whole theme of Purim. And I've tried to make my opinion known. I have to perhaps be a little bit more assertive. We have too many minyanim for Megillah reading here in the shul. The whole function of Purim is to create a sense of community within our people. And therefore, he says, Kamosha Kasav HaChasam Sofer Barachaim Siman Kuf Tzarivav. The Chasam Sofer says this explicitly. So let's follow this line of reasoning. He says, V'hinei, Av Shebechol HaMitzvot Godol HaMetzuva Ve'oseh Umevarchin V'tzivanu. He says, granted, normally when you're cognizant of the fact that you're doing a mitzvah, and that you're doing it because God commanded you to do it, you're doing a much greater act, you're doing a much greater deed. But there are exceptions. The Mishloach Manos Tov She'yitein Meritzono HaChofshi Mitoch Regesh Shel Ahava Le'achiv Ha'ivri. But when it comes to Mishloach Manos, it is better for you not to have in mind that you're fulfilling a mitzvah thereby. It is rather better for you to give Mishloach Manos out of a sense of love and kinship with your fellow Jew. That's the objective that you're supposed to have when you're giving Mishloach Manos. And he says, therefore, that's the reason not to make a bracha. Let's see what his argument is. He says, V'im hu nosein rak al pi tzivoy hu mafchit midat ha'ahava. He says, because if you're just giving the Mishloach Manos because you say, like you go over to a guy and you say, Hineni muchana mezuman lekayem mitzvahs Mishloach Manos. I am hereby prepared to fulfill the mitzvah that my Creator has given to me to fulfill this mitzvah of Mishloach Manos here. So what you're doing is you're objectifying the other as a means of you to fulfill your spiritual worship to your Creator. That's not the objective of Mishloach Manos. You're actually defeating the objective of Mishloach Manos by turning it into a religious ritual over a means of creating friendship between yourself and your friend. How do you create friendship? You can't do it artificially by saying, I got to give Mishloach Manos, so here, you take it. I'm Yoseph. Right? That's not a creation of friendship. Friendship is created by a sincere desire to share of your humantaschen, your delicious humantaschen, with your beloved friend. And so by making a bracha and invoking this whole religious orientation into this mitzvah, you're actually defeating the purpose of creating friendship. You understand what he's trying to communicate to us? He says, "V'chein hadin b'tzedakah." He says the same thing applies to the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. That would be also the reason why you wouldn't make a bracha when you give a Mishloach tzedakah. He says, "She'im hu nosein mitoch rachmanos or mitoch avas Yisrael, tov yoser mimisha nosein mitoch tzivuy ukefiyah." He says, because what should be your motivation for giving tzedakah? I have rachmanos on you. I truly love you because you're my brother or my sister. And that's supposed to be my motivation. That's the higher level of tzedakah. If I'm only fulfilling the mitzvah of tzedakah because I have a divine obligation to God to fulfill that mitzvah, that actually diminishes the avos Yisrael. It diminishes the rachmanos. Or at least acts as a distraction to that rachmanos or to that avos Yisrael. Let me just finish the paragraph. And he says, "Ure'ei ma shekasav harambam b'shmona prakav al machlokas hafilosofim im tov yoser lasos al pi tzivuy al pi rotzen pinimi b'hachras harambam bazeh." He says, I refer you to the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos, which is called Shmona Prakim. Mm-hmm. And in that work, the Rambam talks about a debate between philosophers and rabbis regarding whether or not, regarding what is the highest level of motivation for doing something virtuous. The philosophers argued, says the Rambam, your motivation to virtuous behavior should be because it's the right thing to do. And he cites rabbis who say that the motivation for doing virtuous things is because Hashem wants you to do it. So which one is it, says the Rambam? Which is the higher motivation? And so the Rambam actually bifurcates, and he says that there are two different kinds of mitzvahs. There's a mitzvah that is not easily understood by the human mind, such as, not wearing shatnez. I don't mix wool and linen in my garment, and I don't mix meat and milk together, not because it's a rational commandment that makes sense to me. And therefore, a person is supposed to say, like the Rambam says, I really wish I could have a cheeseburger, but Hashem told me not to, and therefore I'm not going to have it. And there, it's a greater level of observance to say I'm going to fulfill the mitzvah only because Hashem told me either to do it or not to do it. But when a mitzvah is based upon virtue that is easily understood by the human intellect, such as charity, such as visiting the sick, a person's motivation should not be, I'm going to visit the sick, or I'm going to, feed the homeless because Hashem told me I have to do it, but because it's the right thing to do. It's the compassionate thing to do. And so the Rav Weinberg is essentially saying that that's what Mishloach Manos and Tzedakah are all about. If it's to create the virtuous connection between Jews, then making a bracha is a distraction from that project. And therefore he says, he says it could be also the reason why we don't make a bracha whenever we honor our parents. Like if I have to go to visit my parents, as soon as I knock on the door, I should say, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvosav etzivanu lechabed es ha'aba ve'es ha'ima. Right? But why don't we make that bracha? He says, because it's a distraction from the compassion that a child has to have for his parents. That sense of gratitude, the sense of indebtedness that a child is supposed to have to his parents. I shouldn't be honoring my parents just because Hashem told me to. I should be honoring my parents because it's the right thing to do. It's the virtuous thing to do. Okay, yes?
Okay, so I don't know if he's the only one who thinks, I understand what you're saying about him, his thoughts about that. So I have a problem with this tzedakah part. For example, the prayer the tefillah that you say for the sick when you're in between the Torah reading, right? And it also, I think it also happens when you're doing Kaddish, like at a cemetery, if you're saying something. It always says, because I am giving, like you're praying for the soul of that person or for the health of a person, but then it continues to say, because I am giving tzedakah on his behalf. So it always seemed to me, it's like sort of like a quid pro quo, you know, because I'm giving tzedakah.
Right. But that's a different issue. That's not a contradiction to what Rav Weinberg is saying. Rav Weinberg says you should give tzedakah because it's the virtuous thing to do. But even though giving tzedakah is a virtuous deed, you do have a right to bargain with God. The Gemara even says, if a person says, I hereby give this coin so that my child should survive his illness, harei zeh tzadik gamur, that this person is completely righteous. Why? Because he believes in divine providence. He believes that there are consequences for our virtuous deeds and our bad deeds. Anyone who believes in that and understands that there are consequences for how we behave is a righteous person. I know that it's the right thing to do to give tzedakah, but I also know what I need in life. I also know that Hashem will reward those who act virtuously. So there's nothing wrong with that. You can make bargains with Hashem. As a matter of fact, it's virtuous to do so. It's not a contradiction to this idea. All he's saying is that when you do give the tzedakah, it's not proper to have any of that other stuff in mind. Do it because you want to be compassionate to the individual. After, before, right, whatever you're thinking, whatever bargains you want to make with Hashem before or after, you have every right to do so. Okay. He said, let's go on to the next paragraph. I want to let you have a couple minutes early. Uvazer nirali lifshot svekam shel achronim im kofen al mishloach manos kemo shekofen al tzedakah. Shemishloach manos ayidei kefia ina klum v'shayni tzedakah dahasamani mevakesh lachem lahasbir ravono. He says, based on this, there's a question that's asked by some rabbis, and that is, can we coerce a person to fulfill the mitzvah of mishloach manos? We know that we can coerce a member of the community to pay a tzedakah tax. If, let's say, there's a person in the community who needs tzedakah. There's a sick child who needs the hospital bill to be paid. A well-organized community can assess every single member of the community to contribute to that child's hospital bill. That is actually a law. That is part of the community. You can assess tzedakah. But he says Mishloach Manos is different. He says, because if the whole purpose of Mishloach Manos is to generate friendship, how can I force you to become a good friend? How can I force you to generate compassion when you lack it? When you don't have the internal feeling of wanting to have friends? So he says that's different. He says tzedakah is different because you have to participate as a community member. We can coerce you because that kid needs help. And therefore we can coerce you even if you don't feel the internal feelings. But if the sole purpose of Mishloach Manos is to generate friendship, and that person will be just fine without your humantashen, there's no reason to coerce you because there's no need at hand which requires us to coerce you. And then he finally says, we'll finish with this, he says, Va'od nirli lechadesh shemishloach manos hi be'emes mitzvah timidit b'chol hashana. He says, another reason why you don't make a bracha on Mishloach Manos is because the mitzvah of creating friends, of being nice to people so that there's a sense of community and connection that you have with others, that applies every single day of the year. It's not just on Purim that there's a mitzvah to be nice to people and present people with nice things. There's a mitzvah every single moment of your life to be compassionate and nice to people because it's a virtuous thing to be compassionate and it's a virtuous thing to create human contact. And he says we only do it on Purim to remind ourselves of the essential need for that within every Jewish community. But that doesn't mean that it's a unique mitzvah to Purim. Mishloach Manos was something that was done every Yontif, that people would send gifts to their friends every Yontif. They would send food gifts to their friends. Now we emphasize it on Purim, but it's a daily mitzvah. And that's another reason why you don't make a bracha on it, because it's something that you do every single moment of your life, or that you're supposed to do every single moment of your life. And with that, I hope you have better perspective on the purpose of Mishloach Manos. It's not to outdo with the nicer package and the cellophane and the basket in this. It's not to bedazzle people with your hamantashen, and it's not to fatten people who don't need it, the calories, right? The purpose of Mishloach Manos is to create friends, is to create friendships. So therefore, the proper way to give Mishloach Manos is not just to give to the people that you already love, but it's to give to people that sometimes you have difficulty with, and that you've had strains in the relationship with. And in that way, you really are bringing our community back together. Have a freilich and Purim, everyone.